So for our final speaker of this session, before we go into that discussion, and by the way, do put your questions into the chat function so that we can put them to our amazing panelists very shortly. But before we do that, it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to Wayne Martindale from University of Lincoln, who is going to talk to us next. Welcome, Wayne.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Helen, and thank you, IntelliDigest, for the opportunity of speaking today. What I'd like to do is show you a number of slides and use the National Centre for Food Manufacturing where I work. Could I have my next slide, please? The first slide, please. Thank you. So there's a small picture of us. We're based in Lincolnshire at a place called Holbeach. And Holbeach is quite a small town, but it's quite surprising when you work in the food and beverage industry how many people know Holbeach, because around about a third of all field-grown vegetables are grown within about 30 kilometres of Holbeach. And that creates a cluster of companies, a cluster of innovation around ready to eat meals, ready to prepare meals, and fresh produce, of course. So a huge amount of innovation, and we are associated with the Food Enterprise Zone and have a factory that has been in place for about 10 years where we have advanced processing, advanced engineering, full-scale cooking ability at factory scale. And we're also building another campus about a mile away, which is going to be associated with a technology park where we will be integrating companies that are building in sustainability and using innovation to build out things like food waste. So if I could have my next slide, please. When my children ask me what I do at work, the really simple answer that I've learned to give so that they actually get it is I'm in the business of producing the perfect meal. And we've spoken about that a number of times today, the word convenience, the word of fulfillment, actually engaging with the consumer, gastronomy and so on is absolutely key to that. And what we have is a number of laboratories that will develop new products so we can formulate flavors and tastes and new ingredients, and we can scale that process to factory level so that we're producing half-ton and ton batches of soups, sauces and meals. But most importantly, you can see in the top left-hand corner here, something called a sensory suite. And we engage all those processes of manufacturing and development with that place there. There's 6 booths where people sit and they test and they consume foods and they tell us what about them. Innovation is absolutely gold dust. In many respects, in the food industry, it's the most expensive thing to do is you're dealing with people. And if you wanted to have a sustainable food system, in essence, there's 9 billion views on what a sustainable food system should be. So consumers, I was first told when I came into the food industry, consumers are the really expensive part to understand. At the time I was a pure scientist, a chemist, biochemist, I kind of ignored that statement, but it really is true. If you understand what your consumer wants, you can mold and nudge what happens in the supply chain further back in what we call a bullwhip effect that will result in the perfect meal. Now, if you get the perfect meal, what we can show in our research is that you end up with less waste and more fulfillment. And what we're trying to do is research that process to see how that links to sustainability outcomes and so on. And we can use fancy analytical procedures such as mass spectroscopy to analyze different flavor and fragrance volatiles associated with sauces, so we can fine-tune processes. And we're also using a lot of digitalisation to assess new formulations, new recipes, because around about 150 recipes have been investigated by a number of researchers. And we're looking at that research because Actually, there's only around about 7, 8, 9 ingredients to most recipes. Although when you look on your label of your food product, it could be 20 to 30 ingredients. And there's a really important point there. If we look at most recipes, the actual ingredients that you will see in a cookbook is generally under 10. And one of the more complex cuisines happens to be Thai cuisine. But we tend to have relatively simple recipes. Putting those recipes together gives us the millions of different flavors, fragrances, experiences. We're looking at how we can formulate those things to create the perfect meal using technology, using science, and integrating that with consumer data. Of course, when you look on the label, there's 20 or 30 ingredients. That's a really important point because those extra 20 ingredients are associated with quality, different viscosities, maintaining shelf life, and all those types of things. So we're looking at how we can back off on those ingredients to make food simpler, but maintain the perfect meal. So that's really the business that I'm in. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, the title of this slide will probably upset all marketeers. I've mentioned digitalisation. In many respects, there are, we should think about 70 million choices in the UK. There are 70 million people. We can begin to understand what those 70 million people want, do, how they utilise food and beverages, how we utilise food and beverages, and the outcomes of doing that. And we can begin to do this. So the old idea of creating a trend in London and having it ripple out across the UK is pretty much, as I say here, dead, because we're all starting trends. Avocado on toast from New Zealand is probably a good example of that. There were 20 guys in New Zealand that sat around the table and thought it was a good idea, and it kind of rippled across the world with all sorts of impacts and so on. But one of the things that we do to model these things now is build what we call digital twins. And we've developed a digital twin for consumption where we can plug in all the factors of developing a different type of meal. For instance, we can cut meat by 10% in a diet for Sheffield, Leeds, Manchester, London, and model that up to see what happens over a week. And what these models show us is that the outcomes can be very, very complicated. For instance, we all know that reducing livestock products in a diet decreases the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. And if we reduce livestock products by 10%, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2.5 million tonnes. But because we're using more fresh vegetable and fruit produce, and we waste more of that stuff, it results in a 20% increase in domestic food waste. Now, those types of trade-offs and play-offs are really, really important, and they're largely unseen in much of what we're debating, and they need to be seen at a product development level. Because again, if we get that right at product development level with shelf life and all those types of things, as well as convenience and experience, we end up with sustainable outcomes. The other thing that we can do with these digital twins is we map consumption. So we can map what happens to resources as they flow through supply chains and see systemic outcomes of what happens when they're put together in mills and utilised by us, consumers. And that's really important for the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the goals that we're very keen on looking at in my research group is SDG 12, responsible production and consumption. Basically, because if you don't know where things are and where they're going and how they're being used, you have no chance of reaching any kind of sustainable outcome. Could I have the next slide, please? One of the things about decarbonisation, we've heard about scope 3 emissions and things like this today, is much of the government strategy is focused on clusters. So it's focused on energy generation, cement works, oil refining, and things like that. And one of the things that is often overlooked is the food industry as a cluster. And I just show this map of the east of England. The colour grid shows the intensity of wheat production, and the black dots show poultry production. Now, if anyone tells me that the food industry isn't clustered, I'd show them this map, because it clearly is clustered, and it's already been mentioned. You know, we are prisoners of geography. And there's a reason why field-grown vegetables, 30% of field-grown vegetables are grown within 30 kilometres of where I work, and it's because the soil support the production and the quality of those vegetables for retailers. And those types of soils don't occur everywhere. So there are things that really do matter and constrain our food industry so that they are truly clustered. And when you have a cluster, you can begin to strategically decarbonize and strategically connect and link, but you need that information to do it. So the food industry is clustered. One of the things that we're doing at the moment in Lincolnshire is thinking about a food valley between Grimsby and Holbeach, for example, because the amount of food industry and innovation in that particular area is very, very unique. And there are ports and major roads associated with that cluster. All those things really, really count. Could I have the next slide, please? As I've mentioned, we are a prisoner of geography. We're also a prisoner of nutrition, of course, and the EAT report has been mentioned. One of the pieces of research that I'm really quite excited about at the moment is working with the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, which is based in New Zealand. And that initiative is using something called the Delta model, which basically shows us where the limits to nutrition are. And you can see there when in the graph that the nutritional limits associated with particular nutrients like calcium, vitamin A, vitamin E, potassium, zinc can be qualified using the Delta model. And these things are really, really important because they provide a baseline. And I'm sitting in meetings where people are discussing baselines because we often say that we can't work. We haven't got the baseline to work from. We do have the baseline to work from, and that's often geography and nutrition. Could I have the next slide, please? One of the reasons why we want to do this, of course, is looking at these national indicators. And this has already been mentioned. There's huge inequality in the world, huge, huge inequality. And this map shows that. It's a map of how many calories a typical person are associated with loss and waste every day. And the bigger those red circles are, the more calories are lost or wasted. And you can definitely see something that has followed me throughout my lifetime, the north-south divide. Now, there's two options we can do here. We can bring the south up to our level and to New Zealand and Australia's level. I mustn't leave those out, of course. Or we can kind of meet in the middle. But everything is in place to bring everyone up to our level of wastage. And essentially, high-income countries can afford to waste. Low-income, middle-income countries cannot afford to waste at the moment. So I think we're at a crossover point here, and we know the indicators, we know the measures. We need to have the solutions, and one of those solutions is clearly optimal product development that designs out waste and builds in these sustainable targets that we all know about and are striving for. The number of diets wasted on a daily basis by a typical citizen in a high-income country is 33. It's a tenth of that in low-income countries. Now, that is an extremely unfair and unequal system. Could I have the next slide, please? And this isn't just about calories, of course, because as I said, we're a prisoner of nutrition. So we're a prisoner of the broad scope of nutrition around diets. In the case of protein, the situation is exactly the same. We waste, or we lose per person around about 50% of our daily requirement of protein through waste and loss in the supply chain and domestic use. Could I have the next slide, please? And here we see it again with really, really crucial nutrients that have already been mentioned, very much at the top level of the international organizations list here with vitamin A. Again, very much the same kind of picture. So I put it to people that we can continue as we are and bring everyone up to our level of being able to afford to waste. And I'm all in favor of people being able to afford to do things, but I think there is a sense of responsibility that we have to design better, produce better. And many of the things that we're doing at the National Centre for Food Manufacturing is looking at technologies that can integrate at relatively low cost in a flexible, agile way into existing operations that will reduce energy loading in cooking, for example. The use of domestic cooking and understanding how to cook to instructions is incredibly important. I know a fair amount about cooking and product development. One of the things when people ask me, well, how can I make the perfect roast? Well, one of the things you could use is, and it sounds, often the solutions are relatively simple. To get to the perfect roast, what you need is an oven thermometer and a stopwatch, basically. And that gives you a greater understanding of what's happened, because we usually either undercook or overcook. And when we do that, of course, the experience is lousy and we tend to waste. So there are many things like that are relatively simple that I must say, I think chefs get. I like working with chefs. I'm not a chef. I learn from them. They understand how to put food together. They understand, most importantly, how to put food together so that people enjoy it. And that's a really, really important part of this whole systemic equation here. If you get people to enjoy food, then the logical outcome and the sensible outcome that brands and food companies get is that they don't waste it and they want to consume it again. So that's pretty much the view that we have in my research group, Food Insights and Sustainability, on this matter. But the bottom line is that the whole system at the moment is clearly unequal. And that's followed me around for my lifetime. I remember learning at school, believe it or not, about Willy Brandt's book, North versus South. And, when you look at that, that was published in the early 70s. And some of the policy language that we're seeing today associated with food could have been written back then. We're kind of saying the same things, but we have the ability to intervene and integrate technologies that can solve this. And that's incredibly important. Next slide, please. So this is where I wrap up. I'd just like to say that Holbeach is some way out of the way in many respects, but should you ever find yourself going to the centre of the food industry, which is around that sort of Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk region, then please make contact, and we would love to show you the innovative technologies that we're integrating into food factories. A few years ago, farming was not that popular. And when people started going out onto farms, such as Open Farm Sunday, which happens every year, people saw how things are produced. And I think food factories are a bit like that now with consumers. They're not scary places, they're not frightening places. They're places where a lot of innovation, a lot of sustainability happens, and we would like to demonstrate that. So thank you for listening, and thank you to Intelligest for sponsoring and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today.